Greetings, folks. Welcome to another round of B-Sides at Conf 2018. I am David Paper, and we're going to talk about customer best practices for successful adoption in Splunk Cloud, otherwise known as all about the cloud. All right, forward-looking statements. Everybody's seen this before. All right, so we're going to cover three topics today: people, process, and technology. And apologize, this is not a sales prezo, but I might slip here and there. So who am I? Used to be a Splunk customer for 5 years, been an operations guy for about 20 years, and former Splunk advisory engineer. I've done customer success management. I'm currently a senior escalations manager and technical smoke jumper at Splunk. I'm also happen to be sort of an accidental cloud SME, both for my previous team and my current team. I just get to work with a lot of cloud customers and escalations. And you can find me on the Splunk user community. I'm on Slack at Serby and IRC as SerbyFez. But really the important part is, who are you? This talk is aimed at both new cloud customers, if you are just getting started on your Splunk Cloud journey, or if you are an existing customer. I hope you recognize a lot of what you're going to see, but also pick up at least a couple of ideas. And if that's the case, then I will consider this wildly successful. All right, so let's start with the Splunk admin team. This is probably you, and it's really who owns Splunk Cloud at the customer side. And this is not just a sort of a nominal discussion, but it's going to get into who is able to open tickets with Splunk Cloud support. If you have 1,000 users, you don't want all 1,000 users to open tickets with support. That just doesn't make sense. You really kind of want that to funnel through the local Splunk Cloud admins and really the people on the support entitlement. That gives you a shot at sort of doing the tier 1 triage and cleanup before it gets into support. You also need to know who's going to get maintenance for notifications for maintenance and problems. When Splunk does maintenance on your cloud environment, you don't want to be surprised that there's an interruption in service. And lastly, you should probably have a good idea of who the business owner is. Splunk Cloud doesn't just magically show up in any customer's environment. Someone's got to pay for it. And so knowing what the trigger was to bring Splunk Cloud in and who the person or group was that did it can be very useful to you both right away and further down the road. But the real interesting people are going to be your Splunk users. Not that you Splunk admins aren't interesting, but there's only a few of you. There's going to be a lot of users. And so things you should start thinking about is how many users are going to be in your community? Are you going to be a handful of users, a few dozen, 100, 1,000, 10,000? Splunk Cloud can handle whatever you throw at it from a user community perspective, but you still have to be able to manage that community. It's one of the responsibilities of being a cloud customer. So as you begin this process, think about who's responsible for helping them. And you're kind of going to naturally striate. You may not want to answer every basic user question for access or how to write a super duper simple Splunk search. And at the same time, you're also going to begin to identify power users in your environment. These are the folks that really begin to understand Splunk quickly or have worked with it in other companies and can act as a first tier support for their own team. Along those lines, knowing how many different groups in your company and which use cases that Splunk Cloud is going to be supporting is going to be extremely valuable to you, so you know where you are focusing your attention. If 90% of your usage is on one use case and they happen to be the one that funds Splunk, then you want to probably make sure that you give them the right amount of attention to keep those users, especially power users, happy. So how do you do that? Well, one of the ways you do that is sort of a force multiplier by getting information in front of your user community without you having to personally deliver it. And there's lots of ways to do that. Your internal resources for users are really going to depend on what your company standardizes on. Wikis, Confluence, SharePoints are the easy ones. In those environments, how about some SPL examples? Cut and pastable searches, so your user community can use real data with real searches and see real results without having to go change anything. As a great bootstrap, or this can act as a great bootstrap to getting your beginning customers going without you having to handhold each and every one. The more you put into your local documentation about apps available, event types, tags, what data you've got onboarded, what data is available to users in general, the happier and more self-serving your users are going to be. but ultimately they are going to need to find you, and this is where you get to decide how you want to handle the communication. Internal chat and IM systems are a great way to do it. Maybe you have a channel for Splunk users. Maybe you also have a separate channel for your local Splunk admin team, especially if it's a distributed team where everybody doesn't report to the same people manager. An email alias never hurts. Sometimes questions need attachments or are just longer than a chat system. And you might even want to consider a ticketing system so things don't fall out of your inbox, because that happens to everybody no matter how hard we try and avoid against it. Brown bags and office hours are another great opportunity to get in front of your customers. Either it can be you as a local Splunk admin, or maybe your sales engineer, or if you have a CSM, they can help you out with those things. There's a built-in Splunk search optimizer that can help your internal customers figure out better ways to write Splunk searches, and it will give you helpful hints on how to do so. We have several quick reference guides online at splunk.it. These URLs will be available in the slides, and I will make the slides available to folks after this talk if you're interested. And then, of course, liberally sprinkle pointers to Splunk docs, answers, and the Slack and IRC communities so your users can help find information for themselves when you are sleeping or on vacation or otherwise occupied. But there are going to be times where you just don't have enough info for them, whether it's time or content, and you need help. So Splunk Education is here to help. There's a Getting Started with Splunk page, also linked in here. There's also a Fundamentals 1 class, which is now free as of probably more than a year ago at this point. And it's a class, it's got an exam at the end of the class and a user certification. I highly recommend that you encourage your users, every single one, to take the Fundamentals 1 class. And if you can manage to swing it at your organization, make it a requirement. You cannot have access to your company's Splunk Cloud environment until you complete the Fundamentals 1 class. This does a couple of things. Number one, it ensures that all of your brand new users have at least some exposure to Splunk in a classroom environment that is teaching and helpful. These are all video, on-demand video based, so customers can repeat individual parts of the class as often as they need to until they understand it. And at the end, they will have a 200+ page PDF as a great reference for how to do things in Splunk. This, beyond everything else you put together, will save you a lot of the very basic Q&A that your users will ask you. And from a time perspective, you can't buy back time. And this is one of those things that will help you stretch the time you have. In addition to that, we have a boatload of training videos up on YouTube. Splunkit How To is really a pointer to the Splunk YouTube channel. In addition, finally for you, the newly minted or maybe not so newly minted cloud admin, we actually have a cloud admin course in education. I think this is a 3-day course. It might be 3 afternoons. And it's going to go into much more gory detail beyond what I'm going to cover today for the customer responsibilities of being a Splunk Cloud customer admin responsibilities. And it will help you get some more pointers to resources that will help you as you go through your Splunk Cloud journey. So let's talk about process. Let's get into some technical stuff. Enough with the people pieces. So data onboarding, near and dear to my heart. Data ingestion and data onboarding are sometimes confused, but I actually keep them as two very separate and distinct pieces. Data ingestion is the mechanics of getting data into Splunk, which is creating an app, pushing it out to forwarders, making sure you have permissions to get to your data, having the index and source type defined, and then sending the data to the indexers. Data onboarding, however, is the process of telling Splunk how to find information in your events. The timestamp, where it is, the format, what format the timestamp it's in, how big should your events be? In other words, is 10,000 characters enough, which is the truncation setting? Where to begin and end an event. Some of your events might be multi-line, some of your events might be single line, some of your events might have multiple events in a single line. You want Splunk to get that right. And the more you tell Splunk, the better chance you have of getting that. If you don't give us data onboarding configurations for your source types or your sources, we will do our best effort to guess. And a lot of the times we're going to get it right, but we may not always get it right. And the times we're not going to get it right are probably the times you're really going to wish we had got it right. So take the opportunity, go through the data onboarding process. And that process is defining the props and transforms needed to make Splunk be able to interpret your data correctly for each source and source type. And when you have a new source or source type, you're going to need a place to test it. Splunk Cloud does not provide, at least as of October 2018, a development environment for customers. So you can iterate through the GUI to do source type configurations for props and transforms, or you can do it through Splunk support tickets. However, that does actually take quite a bit more time than if you can do it locally and iterate much faster. The last thing I want to talk about for data onboarding is index separation. So the 3 rules of the game for index separation, in other words, how do you know when I need a new index, are retention, access, and performance. When one of those 3 doesn't match one of your existing indexes, now is the time to go create another index. However, the real sweet spot for Splunk Cloud is about 400 indexes maximum. If you stay below that, you should be good. If you get above that, you may start running into some overall performance problems. So try to keep it under 400. All right, so once you've got your data onboarded, as part of the data onboarding program before you finish is knowing who owns the data source. So data sources could be like NetScaler logs, or they could be Apache logs for a particular application, or they could be checkpoint firewall logs or database logs. You should have a name and a contact information for a person, but preferably a group for that particular data source, because if that data source stops, you need to know who to go talk to. Did they change something? Did something break in between? Is it on the Splunk end? And you should probably know, do I need to page somebody at 3 in the morning to fix this, or can it wait until 9 a.m.? So getting an idea of how critical this data is should be important to your data onboarding process. As part of that, you might be able to identify a very early trusted power user for that data source that then they can help answer questions for other users that will be using that data source along the way. If you are lucky enough and your account team has done a data source assessment, sorry, a little bit of sales presentation here, you might want to use that DSA as a source for contact information, because that DSA will have already reached out to many, if not all the folks in your company to identify data that will be going into Splunk Cloud, and that DSA will have names and contact information for who owns those things. Now, obviously that's a point in time, but it's a great way to start, and it might save you a bunch of legwork. So within Splunk, once you have your data in, you're going to start having users search that data. And Splunk is one of the great examples of this tragedy of the commons problem. Everybody thinks that Splunk is just theirs, even though they know it's not. They kind of tend to treat it like that. So as the Splunk Cloud admin, Splunk Cloud customer admin, it's your responsibility to maintain your users and their search schedules and their dashboards. Now, you don't have to write and touch every single one of them, but you do need to be able to audit them. And you do need to be able to go through and look and review dashboard panels, look to see if they're efficient, look to see if they're using base searches or they're loading saved and scheduled searches. Make sure things like if you have a dashboard that's used on a wall for a NOC or a SOC, that panel isn't loading 55 searches and 4/5 of them are down below the top of the screen. Otherwise, you'll never see them, but you waste all those resources loading the data for those panels. You're going to want to review skip searches on a regular basis, and we'll talk a little bit about why a little bit later. You're going to want to use the monitoring console to look at skip searches. You're also going to want to use it to look at long searches or slow searches, or searches that are returning huge amounts of data, because they take a long time and they have an impact on the system. Lastly, if you are using external auth like SSO or AD or one of those others, and a user is reeked out of that system because they've left the company for whatever reason, their searches are going to be orphaned. And that means if they are previously scheduled, they are no longer going to run. Now, you may not care about that if it's a dashboard, but if it's a set of alerts, you probably do care about that. And so you want to keep an eye on the messages pull down at the top of the UI. When Splunk tells you it starts to find orphan searches, it'll also tell you how to go fix them. All right, so let's talk about alerts for a minute. Splunk Cloud is heavily used by many of our customers to alert in their environment. And as a result, sometimes alerts work really well, but sometimes alerts don't work so well. And I want to cover some of the reasons why they don't work so well. Number one is who owns them. So when an alert fires, who's going to get that message? Is a NOC going to get that message? Is a person going to get that message to their personal email address? Is it going to a cell phone or a cell phone distribution? Or is it going to an email alias that everybody filters and then looks at once a day or once a week? Knowing who is getting these and how they're getting them can help you understand the frequency for scheduled searches, making sure that they don't go into the bit bucket if a person leaves a company and they're the sole recipient of these. Likewise, if it's someone's cell phone who's left the company, you know that they're not going to pay attention to that. And so your alerts are going to go nowhere, and it's just like the alerts don't run. Lastly, on alerts, the 3 states of alerts, most people think that there's 2 states, but there's actually a 3rd state when it comes to Splunk. The first state is the alert run, the search runs and bad stuff is found and the alert goes out. The second state is the alert search runs, it doesn't find anything and goes back to sleep. And doesn't find anything. And doesn't tell you it's found anything because it hasn't found anything. The third state is the search never runs, but the end result is the same as when the search does run but doesn't find anything. And you as the admin or you as the end user don't know which one it was. So if you have skipped searches in your environment, chances are you also have skipped alerts in your environment, and that's really bad. That conversation goes nowhere well when your customers start discovering that and you start fixing it. So let's talk about user administration. So Splunk can do user administration with local accounts, but it's not really fun. It's not fun on premise, and it certainly isn't fun in the cloud. Splunk supports a boatload of SSO options, and I highly encourage you to use them for a couple reasons. Number one, this offloads a lot of user maintenance responsibilities to you as a Splunk admin, for getting people onboarded and password resets and those kinds of things. But more importantly, when somebody leaves the company, you as a Splunk admin don't have to be there the second they're walked out the door to go disable their account. Your single sign-on and your central auth does that for you, and that's really a good thing, especially in large companies that have people come and go every day that are Splunk users. To get this configured, you can do it through the Splunk UI. However, it is not a trivial configuration, and I highly suggest you have somebody on your local staff who runs or is very familiar with your local IDP available to help you, possibly getting on a phone call between you and your Splunk Cloud support engineer to get the configuration working and tested in your environment. It will save you a lot of headaches. All right, so talking about support, you will ultimately end up having to file support tickets sooner or later, and you should probably make sure you know how to do it before you have to do it. And this means knowing where the Splunk support portal is, knowing that you've got your entitlement set up correctly, knowing how to file a case, and feel free to file a case that says, I'm testing, please close and delete me. That's okay, it means the process works, and you have the opportunity to document it internally, not just for yourself, but for other people on your team. When you do open a case for real, the more information you include, the better off everybody's going to be. On a support case that is very light on details, you're going to start a back and forth with your support engineer until they have enough details to figure out what's going on. The more information you can give them the first time around, the better. And I will suggest that if you are having a UI specific problem where you click on something or it doesn't work the way you want versus a search problem, take a video of the process of your screen. On Macs, you can use QuickTime to do this. On Windows, I don't know if it's something built in, but I'm sure there's a plethora of options out there to do video. And you might only need 4 or 5 seconds to show the problem. And if a picture is worth 1,000 words, a video is worth at least 29.97 pictures a second to save you a lot of time and frustration trying to describe your problem. All right, so let's, before we get too much farther, I want to talk a little bit about you as a person and your team as a whole. So when you get Splunk Cloud in a new organization, it is a really good idea for the admins to know why it's there. So are you trying to get off of another tool? Did you have a new exec come in who's used Splunk in another company? Are you trying to solve a very specific use case that there is no solution today and you're starting out from scratch? Talking about the business owner earlier in the talk, that business owner is going to have some amount of business objectives that are tied to your Splunk Cloud deployment. Knowing what those objectives are can only help you in the short run and absolutely in the long run. Reaching out to the business folks who are involved in Splunk Cloud in your environment will only make your life easier. I promise. The other thing is they're the ones that tend to write checks for bigger Splunk Cloud environments. And if you want to grow because you're wildly successful, they're the ones that are probably going to have to be on board. However, it's not just all about the team. Sometimes it's about you. And so Splunk Cloud, especially if you have never used Splunk before, is a great opportunity for you to learn a new tool. Personal goals, maybe you just like to play around and tinker with stuff. Maybe there are some rewards, financial or other perks that go along with it, or just personal growth because you want to learn a new tool outside of, that you can use outside of work. But hey, you get paid to learn it on work time. Never a bad thing. I said you might be decommissioning an old tool. Maybe you're migrating from ArcSight into Splunk, or you're getting off of RSA, one of the RSA products, and I can't remember which one. There's many of them out there, and you're getting onto Splunk. Whatever it is, understand why it's happening, and see if there are any milestones that your company has set up for it. Maybe there are completion bonuses to actually retire a tool that is costing your company a lot of money, and you can save a year's worth of renewal if you can get migrated off of it faster rather than slower. So knowing these things in advance is definitely not going to hurt you or your team. Finally, you might actually get to the point where you just need help, and that's not abnormal. It does happen. Splunk can be complicated, even on the Splunk Cloud side. And you can, if you have PS time, you can use them to help speed up data onboarding, especially make sure your data is SIM compliant if you happen to be running enterprise security. You may use PS to accelerate your user onboarding and initial dashboarding, especially if you have one or two specific use cases you are using to show that Splunk Cloud is the right way to go, and you have some PS time, have them help you get there. App installs. So app installs in Splunk Cloud, there's several ways to do it, but one of the great things is that PS actually can short circuit some of this stuff and make it happen a lot faster. And you can also use them as an opportunity to help create some of your own internal documentation. I mentioned it earlier, and if the PS folks have done app config work or they've done data onboarding, they're going to know about indexes and source types and other things that may make searching easier. They might also be able to help you craft some SPL search examples that will be relevant to your users, not just the junior ones, but maybe some of the intermediate, more senior ones too. All right, so let's actually talk about some technology, because that's the whole reason we're doing this. So Splunk Cloud, you still have to send data to Splunk, and to do so requires some number of forwarders. And you should have an idea of what those forwarders look like in your environment. Maybe you only have a couple, but a lot of customers have hundreds or thousands. And having some diagram of where they are in the network, what you're using to manage them, et cetera, firewalls, all come into play here. And having some picture of this stuff is pretty useful. Along those lines, you really need to make sure you understand the requirements for the data going into your Splunk environment. If you have PCI, if you have PII or PHI data that you need to obfuscate, that's okay, and there are ways to do it. You can either do it directly on the indexers in Splunk Cloud, which you can manage through the GUI or support cases, or you may want to do it on an intermediate forwarding tier, which is a set of forwarders between your edge forwarders on your applications and Splunk Cloud. And there's a myriad of reasons why you may end up wanting an intermediate forwarding tier. It could be your network folks just want to control egress out of your environment, since you might be sending hundreds of gigs or terabytes a day. It might be your firewall folks that don't want to open outbound port connections to the internet for potentially tens of thousands of forwarders on internal servers and having to go through that NAT pool. Or you may just want to be able to control your iteration for doing PCI, PHI, or PII information redaction, and be able to iterate much faster on local servers you control versus having to go through the UI, waiting for indexer restarts, or going through support cases. There's a bunch of different reasons you may want it or may not want it, so it does depend, but these are things, the sooner you start thinking about them and identify whether you need them or not, the happier you're going to be. So once you identify whether you need an intermediate forwarding tier, you can start thinking about managing your deployment server. So Splunk forwarders do not just get deployed out to edge hosts and then forgotten about forever. We'd love to think that that's the case, but it's just really not. Code needs to be upgraded, security fixes do happen, performance improvements and functionality, all are good reasons to make sure that you know who owns your universal forwarder or your heavyweight forwarder installations, especially if they're out on, say, laptops or devices that you don't necessarily control, what that installation process is and what that upgrade process is. In fact, you might even want to test that upgrade process before you have to test the upgrade process, because you might find some issues maybe at the layer 8, layer 9 level for organization and determining how long this stuff takes when you might need to go touch 8 or 12,000 forwarders in your environment. As you are setting up your forwarders, some things to be aware of. If you happen to be using older forwarders for some reason, you don't want to leave the default admin password, which is the word change me, because prior to 7.1 in Splunk, every forwarder out there on the entire planet had the same login and password by default unless you changed it. This is really bad when it comes to, say, penetration testing or going through any sort of auditing. Likewise, running your forwarder as root is probably not a really good idea. unless you have a very specific set of use cases that require you to do so. Because really the forwarder has this thing called scripted inputs. And scripted inputs are a great mechanism for running a local shell script or binary, whether it's on Linux or Windows, like PowerShell, to go off and get data and shove into Splunk that you can't necessarily read from a file. Well, that's awesome, except that you have just created a remote script execution engine, and which is controlled by a central thing called a deployment server. So if you need it, that's awesome. Make sure your deployment server is properly locked down, and we'll talk about that on the next page. But if you don't need it, turn it off. And this is part of the hardening of your forwarder. Turn off your scripted inputs. If you don't need to talk to the REST port on 8089, feel free to turn it off completely, or maybe just make it listen on localhost, because there's no place like home. If you're running heavyweight forwarders and you're not using the KV store, or you're not using an app that needs it, turn it off. It also listens on ports externally and tends to trigger things like Nessus scans, and makes a lot of work for Splunk admins, even cloud admins, that they probably just don't really want to deal with. Next up on the hit list is operating system flavors. So the universal forwarder runs on lots and lots of OSs, but there are a few that it doesn't. And for the ones it doesn't, syslog is a great way to get data off those hosts to a syslog collector, and we're going to talk about that in a little bit. But forwarders management, for the most part, is not terribly complicated, but it can get a little tedious. And so as you are working with your forwarders and you're beginning to write apps and manage them, you're going to need to think about who has access to your deployment server to help you manage these. You as a Splunk admin may want to or be required to manage every app that goes out to your forwarders, but very likely you want to delegate some of that responsibility to the owners of the apps that you're pulling logs for. And so access to version control, like a Git or other tool where you can distribute the stuff out, but still contain some amount of control over what goes out, say like a merge pull request type of thing where you have at least one person review the configs before they go out, is a really good idea. It also accidentally provides auditing, soup to nuts, which is always great when you're trying to not play the blame game. You can determine if you want to restart your forwarders or not, depending on the app that you push out. Some configs do need to restart, others don't. I personally am a fan of, as long as it's going to go out, go ahead and restart the process, because if you can't restart the process without sending off alarms, that's probably something you should have a pretty good understanding about in your environment. Plus, if the process doesn't restart correctly, you want to know that there's a bad config out there sooner rather than later. Somehow it managed to get through the process. Lastly, output and SSL key management. Splunk Cloud will provide you all of your outputs.conf configs that you will need to roll out to your forwarders. They will also provide SSL keys. Occasionally, but not often, they will give you updated versions of these. You want to be able to update these in an easy manner from your deployment server. It would be really unfortunate if you had to go deploy all new universal forwarder code, like an upgrade, just to get an updated set of SSL keys or updated outputs.conf out there. So make it easy for yourself in the future. Try to cover as many of these things early in the process as you can. All right, so a few other things to cover. Data path. So you as a customer are going to be sending data to Splunk Cloud, which means you're going to be putting boatloads of bits and bytes up on the WAN connections outbound. Make sure you have enough bandwidth to do this. Yes, there is compression. It's roughly about 10 to 1, but if you're going to be ingesting a couple of terabytes of data a day, that still means you're going to shove 200 gigabytes out of your WAN interfaces into Amazon. This is not generally a big deal unless you have fairly small network links. So make sure you can not only handle steady state, but your connectivity can handle some bursts. And because you may have firewall maintenance windows where they just turn off external network connectivity for 2 or 3 hours while they do the work, they turn it back on, you have a whole boatload of back pressure, and it will go as fast as you let it, or as fast as the network can handle it. Just be aware. Same thing with your firewalls. Make sure your firewalls have capacity both on the bandwidth and packets per second perspective. And if you're using any sort of SSL proxies, especially transparent ones in the network, make sure you are aware of them and they're aware of you. Because if you overdrive them, you will affect lots of other people in your organization. All right, one of my least favorite topics is SSL key management. So Splunk provides the SSL keys between your forwarders and the indexers, but you may be running an intermediate forwarding tier and running your own SSL keys between the forwarders and the IF tier. Or you may be running on-premise hybrid search head or some number of heavyweight forwarders that have GUIs on them. If you choose to put SSL in there, and I think that is a spectacularly good idea, especially if you're using single sign-on, you want to make sure you know when those keys expire. It's no fun to have your keys expire on you, especially when it gets in the way of customers using Splunk or you getting data into Splunk. How you do that is your choice. Just make sure you have some sort of a plan. All right, only a few more slides. Well, maybe a few more than a few more. All right, so we talked about this earlier, syslog. So in Splunk Cloud, you can get data into Splunk Cloud one of two ways. Over port 9997, which is the one most customers use, because it is Splunk to Splunk. You can also get data into Splunk Cloud via the HTTP event collector, which is total awesome sauce. I love it. However, you cannot send syslog data into Splunk Cloud because syslog is not encrypted, and that's bad. So you will need to set up some sort of a syslog aggregation collector if you want to do syslog data into Splunk. I suggest looking at syslog NG or rsyslog if you're on a Unix platform, Kiwi on Windows if that floats your boat, and really fronting whatever syslog solution you put up by some sort of a load balancer so you can get several syslog servers behind that for both capacity and redundancy, because let's face it, sometimes servers have to get rebooted for patching, and syslog being UDP means that data is gone. So you always want to make sure that at least one server is up at all times. If you have your syslog server listening on both UDP and TCP, make your VIP listen on UDP and TCP and have your VIP test the TCP port on your servers. If that TCP port goes down, take both UDP and TCP out of the list and then go figure out how to fix it. As you're thinking about this, especially if you're going to be collecting gigabytes or maybe terabytes of syslog data, think about some rules for how you're going to segregate this data coming in. Some sort of logical groupings, maybe by date. Maybe your file system looks like /logs, /device type, /year, /month, /day, /host name, and then the logs in that. So you can compress log data sort of a whole tree at a time, or you can roll stuff off if you need disk space, whatever. This gives you lots of flexibility, and it gives you the ability to see data broken down by individual host even before it gets into Splunk and do it very easily. Another option that I actually just came across is maybe you have multiple port listeners on your VIP. So say Juniper syslog data goes to one port, Cisco syslog data goes to another port, Linux syslog data goes to a third port, and then you can easily separate those ports into different file system structures to make management of that stuff easier. Plus you can figure out in your path, you can say /log/Cisco/date or log/Linux/date. And make it easy for you to manage your log retention on disk. All right, speaking of retention, Splunk Cloud gives you lots of opportunity, in fact, all of the opportunity to configure your own indexers, or indexes. And the things to configure also include the retention time. By default, Splunk does 90 days. But if you pay for a year or 6 months or 2 years of retention, you want to make very sure that when you configure your indexes, you get your retention configurations right. Splunk does not audit this for you because we assume you know what you're doing when you make your configurations. It never hurts to have another set of eyes look at it, and it also never hurts to maybe run what you're doing by your sales engineer to make sure that you are getting, I'm on camera. Hi, Joanna. Making sure you're getting what you need from a retention perspective. No one likes a conversation where you think you have a year of data in Splunk Cloud, and it turns out you really only have 90 days. All right. When you are going to do maintenance, either asking us to do maintenance or we need to do maintenance for you, you should be aware of what normal maintenance policy your organization has. Splunk Cloud can usually accommodate those policies. We absolutely do 24/5, again, as of October 2018. 24/7 on the weekends is a little bit harder, but we do have some accommodations for customers. Get in touch with us and let us know when you need that. And if you have a preferred maintenance window, tell us what it is. Open a support case, let us know. We can document it and be able to refer to it internally before we reach out to you asking for availability for maintenance windows. Future apps. So getting data into Splunk Cloud is usually forwarder based. But there's a few opportunities where, like, say, Database Connect, or you're looking at JMX data from Java servers. We can run those inputs in the cloud, but chances are your security team is not going to want to open your super duper corporate high security database to the internet so something in Amazon can talk to it. So you're probably going to want to run a local heavyweight forwarder to collect this data and send it into Splunk Cloud when you are ready. I have firewall considerations on here, but it's also network considerations. It's also potentially that your database administrators or your Java server administrators aren't going to want to open that up either. So a myriad of really good reasons to think about where you're going to pull your data from. And some of these data pulls may not just be, some of these reasons to run on-premise pieces may not just be data ingestion. It could also be running search or doing something with Splunk that unfortunately does not pass the cloud vetting requirements. So some things can't leave your network. Maybe you don't want your database connections to ever traverse open internet, and I totally understand that. Or you have binaries that do things like open non-encrypted, non-authenticated connections to third-party servers and send data to them. Splunk Cloud will not be allowing that, and so you'll have to come up with another way to do that. And a hybrid search head on-premise that talks to search indexers in cloud is a great solution for that. Fully supported, and is a very well-known pattern. All right, talking about apps. If you go into Splunk Base and look for apps under product, you will see Splunk Cloud if that app has been vetted for cloud. And a specific version, the vetting is done via version specific. So if the absolute latest and greatest has not been vetted yet, but previous versions have, that's actually okay. By requesting an install, we will go find the latest version and vet it. If you have custom apps that your company or organization has created that you want to run in your cloud environment, we can do that too. Up on dev.splunk.com, there's a set of requirements for app vetting. There's also a local tool you can download and install that uses Python to look at your app and tell you if it passes. And lastly, there's an API that you can query and upload your app to, and it will tell you if it does the right thing. And if it doesn't do the right thing, it will give you very specific information about what failed and why it failed. Once apps are installed, there are some things that Splunk Cloud just can't do for you, even if it's a self-service app install. Things like if you install the app for AWS, Splunk doesn't know your keys and your secrets or your account IDs. You are going to have to configure that in the app as part of the enablement of that application once it's installed. And there's probably a few others, but that is the one that seems to bite customers the most. All right, so docs. We have lots of documentation. Including if you happen to be inheriting a Splunk deployment from a previous Splunk admin, we have an inherited deployment section. Now this is generally oriented towards on-premise customers, but a lot of the information here is very germane to Splunk Cloud admins. Take a look at it. It's a great checklist, if nothing else, just to make sure you haven't missed anything. The final thing I want to cover in docs is Google's algorithm for search priority seems to change often enough that sometimes the word Splunk and Splunk Cloud are interchanged in the URL, even if you search for Splunk or Splunk Cloud. So when you're looking at Splunk Cloud docs specifically, make sure the word Splunk Cloud is in the URL. If it's not, chances are 99% of the time, the docs are exactly the same, but there's just enough of a difference and some things that Cloud doesn't support or supports differently that you do not want to end up looking at the wrong thing and getting frustrated down the line. So this is how to find me. So I'm dpaper@splunk.com. I'm on the community Slack a lot. If I'm not on and you're happy to see me, you can direct message me and I'll respond as soon as I see it. I'm also on IRC and I'm all over answers as David Paper. So Splunk Cloud, there is no end. It is an everlasting journey and we're here to help you make it successful, both for you and your company. Thanks for listening.